Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you to Mrs. Pinucero for inviting me here again. It's not my first visit to the college, but I'm always happy to come, and have always been very warmly received. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Lives of the Saints and how I came to write it. I grew up in a small town in southwestern Ontario, Leamington, near Windsor, as a child of Italian immigrants. And growing up, I just wanted to leave Leamington. And growing up, the last thing I wanted to be was a child of Italian immigrants. And when I decided I wanted to be a writer, the last thing I wanted to write about was about being the child of Italian immigrants. My role models were Shakespeare and Dostoevsky and Thomas Pynchon and Nabokov, and I just wanted to write, great world literature. I didn't want to write sort of ethnic Italian-Canadian literature. Through my undergrad, I had done a couple of writing courses, kept up this idea that I wanted to be a writer. Then I started a master's program in creative writing in Montreal, and as part of that program, I had to write a thesis, so a book-length work of fiction. And I decided I was going to try to write a novel, and until then I'd been writing strictly short stories, and in my stories my characters had very little sort of cultural baggage. They had very generic names like Alex and Mary. They existed in a kind of cultural void because I didn't want to start talking about all that ethnic stuff. And when I decided I was going to write a novel, I realized, well, I'm going to need to have more material, more background, and that was sort of how I got stuck writing about Italy, because I had these two characters in mind, and I thought, well, they have to have a history, and in thinking about their history, I thought about their parents, who had, where they might have come from, and I had to go back to stuff that I knew. Initially, Lives of the Saints was just going to be a kind of prologue. I was telling the Writers' Craft group this, to what was actually the first inspiration I had, which is a story that now takes place in the third novel in the trilogy that Lives of the Saints begins, a novel called Where She Has Gone. It's about a relationship between a brother and his half-sister. And I started thinking, well, what's their background? That's how I came up with the story of Christina. And that was partly because I needed for the sister to be illegitimate. In other words, to be the product of an affair. And in my own experience, the most common way so I wanted to separate the husband and wife, and in my experience, the most common way for that to happen was through immigration. In Italian immigration, and I think with many other groups as well, the husbands often went ahead to the country they were going to, in this case Canada, and left behind their wives and children until they had enough money to call them over and make a home for them. So that was the model that I knew from my experience, and that was what landed me in Italy. And once I was there, I was stuck with the fact that A, I had never lived in Italy, and B, here I was telling a story about immigration, which was the last thing I wanted to do. The one thing that had occurred to me by then was that, in fact, the story of immigration was a much bigger story than it had seemed to be when I was a kid. When I was a kid, it seemed that to be an immigrant was really to be on the margins, to be weird, to be different. I just wanted to be like everyone else. As I grew up, I began to see that, the immigration story was really kind of the big story of our times, that in fact, it was a common experience of so many people in this country, and in fact of so many people around the world, and in some ways was the contemporary story that, even if you haven't moved from one country to another, almost everyone has moved from one place to another, from the countryside to the city, from one part of the country to another, and often those moves are just as disruptive as across borders because they involve a complete change in lifestyle and culture. And we live in a world where that has become commonplace. In the past, it was much more common that you would be born, live, and die within the same area that your parents had been born, lived, and died in. In Italy, they had this term called campanalismo, which meant that you lived your life within hearing range of the campane, the village church bells. So you never were further away from your hometown than the distance that the sound of the bells would travel. And this was true of many people of my parents' generation in Italy, that they had never been more than 20 miles from home in their lives, and that would have been true of their parents and their parents' parents. So the connection to place and the connection to a very specific kind of culture was very entrenched and very deep. At the time that Lives of the Saints takes place was a kind of pivotal turning point moment for a lot of these villages, because suddenly vast amounts of people were leaving and going away across the sea, and these towns, which until then had lived in an almost kind of medieval world. In other words, almost nothing had changed since the Middle Ages, were suddenly being propelled in one fell swoop into modernity. And all their old customs and beliefs and all the old values that they'd lived by until then were under challenge. And for me, Lives of the Saints was, I guess, a way of asking that question. You know, what happens when that moment of disruption comes? And you know, one of the forces of that disruption in the novel is the character of Christina, who I conceived of specifically as someone who flouts the old rules and the old ways of doing things. To an extent, I based her character on people I'd actually known in my own experience. I grew up in the Italian community, and we tended in the past to think of Italian culture as somewhat misogynistic, one that's very male-dominated. My own experience was that women in Italian culture, and particularly Southern Italian culture, tend to be very strong and often dominant, at least within the domestic sphere. So I had a strong tradition of very strong women in my past that I drew on for Christina. And there was also a history of, in southern Italy, of the men often having to be absent from their towns because of poverty, because they couldn't make a living there. So they would be away for months at a time, working for some landlord, several days' journey from home, or even in the north of Italy or in other parts of Europe, even before they started emigrating across the sea, and even before they started emigrating in a permanent way. Often they would leave for years. They would go to the States for 5-10 years, earn some money, and come home and stay home, or to Argentina. And in fact, that had given the women a certain amount of power, because they were, running things. The men were away, the women were running things. They had to raise the children, they had to grow, crops on the few plots of land, so a kind of subsistence level of farming to have food through the winter. And the men were kind of an inconvenience often when they did come back. There's a book called Christ Stopped at Eboli by Carlo Levi that talks about a town in southern Italy where many of the men were away by immigration, and the tremendous power that the women of the town ended up taking on as a result, and also the fact that many of them had taken lovers in the absence of their husbands because their husbands were away for so long. And even in my mother's hometown, there's a town nearby called Agnone where there was a convent where they had something called La Ruota, the wheel. And the purpose of this wheel, and this is going back to the late 1800s that this was installed, the purpose of this wheel was for women who had had illegitimate births to be able to bring their babies in the dead of night. You put it in the wheel on one side, and you rotate the wheel, and the baby goes inside the convent so the nuns can take it in and put it in the orphanage. It was a way of getting rid of your unwanted, illegitimate births anonymously. So the fact that they had an actual machine to deal with this issue gives you an idea of how widespread the problem was. So those are some of the, I guess, some of the origins of the novel for me. I wanted to open it up now to questions. I know some of you have started reading the book. I'd be very happy to address them.